Good evening and welcome everyone. On behalf of Blair County Historical Society, I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. I think she's no stranger to most people in the room. Harriet Gaston earned her bachelor's degree from Davidson College in North Carolina in political science and her master's degree from Vanderbilt University. She has called Altoona home for the last 33 years. During that time, she has worked as an undergraduate studies advisor at Penn State Altoona, and she wears many other hats there as well, working with their African American Read-In program and as well their Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. If I brought along the whole list of other things that she does, I'd have to bring a poster board to mention all of them. Outside of Penn State, she's involved with Leadership Blair County, Arts Altoona, the African American Heritage Festival, which is taking place next weekend, and the African American Heritage Project, which she has been in charge of since 1997. Those in the history community know her very well for her preservation and history work, including recent work with the Eastern Light Cemetery, which was featured in the news and on the front page of the newspaper. Those of us at Baker Mansion know her quite well as a former board member, and she's working with us on a new exhibit for next year on the African American heritage of Blair County. Please join me in welcoming our friend and our history colleague, Harriet Gaston.
And the beginning. Let's do that, right? Okay. Shall we? Yes. All right. So, hopefully you can hear me and see the screen here. Since 1990, May 1, I started at Penn State Altoona. My goal was just to be there for 5 years. That changed. So I've gotten involved in documenting the history, and at the end you'll see I give tribute to the Penn State Altoona resources and Penn State University resources because there's no way. Prior to digitization, I would have found most of this. So I often get asked about the Underground Railroad in Blair County. Did it exist? If so, where? What evidence do we have? So this is actually my third type of presentation I've created just for my benefit. But I'm pretty sure I will get to what you are looking for. So, answer the question, what's the Underground Railroad? How do we measure what the likelihood of, the probability of it from a scale by Dr. Judith Wellman? When did Black folks get into central Pennsylvania? And probably the other question behind that is why? Something called the Compromise of 1850, which would prevent the Civil War from happening for another 11 years. And then, out of that compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and its impact on central Pennsylvania. So when you're helping people escape, that involves money. That involves places. That involves an attitude. So what exists in this area to support that? And yes, there are indeed documented incidents, as well as the background, the history of people who came here fleeing slavery. And then I like to add, if you don't believe me, where can you find the stuff, the information I've presented? It's in my bibliography. So the Underground Railroad involved people. And as you hopefully that you're reading, it was not only whites and blacks, Native Americans and Hispanics were involved. As I've learned from doing this research, if you were living in Texas, you're not going north. You're going south. Mexico had abolished slavery before the War of Mexico, the Mexican-American War. They had banned it. So part of that war was to bring in slaves. The freedom to do that. Also, Florida, Cuba, Trinidad, all those islands were places that people could get to if they were further south. Round here, as hopefully you will see, it's the border states, Virginia, Maryland. I found somebody from Delaware who came here. So they're typically not coming from like North Carolina or Lower Virginia to get here. It is the goal to get people safely to freedom. That was their end goal. And using the terminology of the railroad, different people, different places were given names. So those who would go down south, and usually that was a former enslaved person who had escaped, because they know how to get there and get out without getting caught. And there is one incident that occurred where that was happening in Blair County. They guided them to safety and people that they would meet. We have the conductors. The enslaved are called passengers. Their homes and places were stations. So that taking that terminology. If you're wondering where that came from, it was a Southerner in Kentucky, if I recall correctly. They're chasing someone. They get across the Ohio River and they disappear. And the gentleman says it was like they went to an underground railroad. And that's what we think that terminology comes from. So I was trying to put this into my presentation today. When I was doing this one for today, I thought I'll just put it up front. Dr. Judith Wellman is an emeritus professor from SUNY Oswego. So she is in the north, near Erie, Buffalo, makes sense. They're heading toward Canada. So it makes sense because trying to get them into Canada. So she has 5 different levels of determining if what we know about, what we've heard, what we've read, what we find would document something as being the Underground Railroad was here. The first level is a story. Other than that, we're not sure. Number 2, no reason to doubt it because you've heard it many, many years, and so probably somebody else says it. But again, no evidence. Number 3, do we have documentation of people expressing abolitionist views? To do that before the Civil War was sticking your neck out. That was not something popular to say, I am for the abolition of slavery. Do you have people of African American descent involved in the abolitionists? Are there oral traditions, some evidence of activity such as an anti-slavery society membership? They did exist in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, I believe. I've never seen anything here in central Pennsylvania yet. Level 4, almost true. Considerable evidence of involvement. So again, we have oral traditions that are sympathetic to freedom seekers, evidence of direct involvement with the Underground Railroad. High probability of Underground Railroad involvement, but lacking direct primary source evidence. Strong written evidence from others coupled with a strong oral tradition make a compelling case for Underground Railroad involvement. Dr. Wilbur Seibert of the Ohio State University gathered stories. He had his graduate students write to people in the towns and communities because they were realizing Black folks were dying who were formerly enslaved. So they wanted to get those stories out. So there is a book written about the Underground Railroad and those stories that they were gathered. There are stories about that, about what happened in Bedford and Blair and Clearfield. Indiana, and so forth. All right. Level 5. Persons or sites identified through oral history or written sources, collaborated specifically by at least one reliable primary source. Strong primary source evidence of Underground Railroad activity stories about the Underground Railroad that are supported by a primary source recorded by someone who was actually involved. An obituary written by someone who knew the person may qualify as compelling evidence. Let's look at number 5. Let's make sure we know for number 5 there. Let's hope we get there. So let's look at the past. In 1840, before the Fugitive Slave Act, before the formation of Blair County, this is what the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania looked like. You might be able to tell where Blair County is going to come out of from looking at that. But yeah, Hollidaysburg does exist at that time, okay? Martinsburg, I'm not sure. Williamsburg, I know, does exist at that time. Tyrone Township, Antis Township. So there are places with the census records. And you can see Maryland and Virginia. There is no West Virginia. That will not happen until the Civil War. And then you can see, hopefully, 1850, and Blair that's Huntington. So that should be Blair coming into existence. Okay. So 1846, Blair County is established, and with Hollidaysburg as the county seat. So, how did black folks get here to central Pennsylvania? So, the 1790 census records 43 black people living in Huntington County out of a total of 7,565 residents. More than likely, they were enslaved. Until the abolitionists, the gradual abolition of slavery in the 20, people were bringing their slaves from the east to central to the west. So Blair, Holiday, I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on some poor woman. She was like, that's my relatives you're talking about. As I was naming the founders of this area, they had at least one person listed as property. Records show that enslaved black people were living in Tytuna, for those of you not familiar, near Sinking Valley, Woodbury Township, Frankstown Township, Allegheny Township, and Blair Township in the 1780s and 1790s. In March of 1780, a Pennsylvania law was passed, 1780, for the gradual abolitionists of those who were born from enslaved parents. In 1847, a Pennsylvania law was passed to emancipate all who were still enslaved. So if they're born after 1780, they were free, but they were free to enslave parents. In 1820, 40 black residents live in the townships of Allegheny, Antis, Frankstown, Newry, Tyrone, Williamsburg, and Woodbury, out of a total of 5,749 residents in that part of Huntington County. In 1830, 38 residents lived in the township, so we lost 2. Of Allegheny, Antis, Frankstown, Williamsburg, and Woodbury, out of a total of 7,632 residents in that part of Huntington County. It's small print here. And I need my glasses. In 1840, 160 residents live in the townships of Allegheny, Antis, Blair, Frankstown, Tyrone, and Woodbury, and the boroughs of Hollidaysburg and Williamsburg. 26 black residents lived in Antis. Bellwood, for those not familiar with the cat. I've been trying to find their names in the census records. And 89 Black residents lived in Hollidaysburg. The total residents in this part of Huntington County was 13,465 residents. Jobs. Think about jobs. What's happening in Hollidaysburg? You got things moving from one side of the state to the other. So the Allegheny Portage Railroad has been established, and they're moving people, they're moving things across the country, and you need bodies. So people are moving there. Once they get there, they need to be fed. They need to have their needs met, like barbering. Porter, being a porter at a hotel, as people dock and stay, and then get back on the canal and travel on. So this is what's bringing people to this area, just like it does for any group of people. They're looking for jobs. So this is folks that I've been made aware of that have lived in the area of Huntington, Bedfordish, that will eventually come into Blair County. James H. Lyons was appointed postmaster in Salemville, PA in 1882. His father, Benjamin Lyons, was brought to Martinsburg in 1810 as a slave and was emancipated in 1824. Mrs. Flores Pittman submitted an article on January 15, 1916 in the archives of the Altoona Tribune on the history and contributions of Black County Blair citizens. She informed the readers that the William Taylor family came to the Allegheny Forest Township in 1834 from Lancaster, PA, or Lancaster. They worked for the Bakers. The son of that family, a William H. Taylor, born in 1840, fought in the Civil War for Company H-32 United States Colored Troops. James Burris came to this area in the same year of 1834. They were followed in 1838 by Jacob Lee. In 1839, William Walton came. Thomas Shorter came in 1840. William Nesbitt came from Carlisle, PA in 1844. And John Alexander with approximately 40 to 85 emancipated people. The news articles keep changing. Moved to Bedford in the late 1840s, then moved to Altoona in 1856. Thomas O.B. Carter of Falkville County, Virginia, freed them through his will. The will was contested in court after his death, but his wishes were carried out. Moses Brown, born in 1827 in Bedford, moved to Hollidaysburg in 1846. His wife, Sidney Ellen Keith, born in 1835, was from Taylor Township of Blair County. Her family moved to Hollidaysburg after her birth. Some people know Moses Brown for his ice cream. Other people might know Moses Brown for Brown's Pond in Hollidaysburg. If you don't, well, I'll explain that later. All right. So, yes, he was a well-known caterer, restaurant owner. Did it at Lakemont, did it at Del Delight, now American Legion. He was known for that. Blair County Census records of 1850 and 1860. As I said, Blair County is established in 1864. Yay! The 1850 census records 20,177 residents in Blair County. 261 Blair residents lived in the township of Allegheny, Antis, Blair, Catherine, Frankstown, Houston, North Woodbury, Snyder, Tyrone, Woodbury, and in the boroughs towns of Gaysport, Hollidaysburg, Martinsburg, and Williamsburg. 141 black residents lived in Hollidaysburg, and 19 black residents lived in Gaysport. For those of you not familiar, Gaysport was a separate borough until the 20th century, the start of the 20th century. The Pennsylvania Railroad purchased the land that would become Altoona in 1849. It was established as a borough in 1854. The 1860 census records record 20,892 residents in Blair County. 283 of them lived in the townships of Allegheny, Blair, Logan, North Woodbury, Tyrone, and in the boroughs of Altoona, Gaysport, Martinsburg. Oh, I did Altoona twice. Tyrone, Williamsburg. 115 black residents lived in Hollidaysburg, 14 in Gaysport, 52 now live in Altoona, 35 lived in Tyrone, and 17 lived in Williamsburg. We were there. We've been there. First, there's designation I think the Blair County Genealogical Society does about first families. I don't know if they still do that, but these people are the first families as well. And this is one reason why I do it. I wanted to get out there so those families can see it. And, all right, can we pay some money to do or fill out a form, whatever, and submit it? All right. So before the 1850 compromise, this is what the United States looked like. So the peach is the states, the territories, and Alaska and Hawaii belong to other countries. Actually, Hawaii is its own country. Okay. So people are moving. We had the Mexican-American War. So again, we're moving from the east to the west. So the United States senators from the north and the south crafted this Compromise Act. It was to address the expansion of the United States after the Mexican-American War and the 1849 Gold Rush in California. The compromise addressed how the newly created states of California and Texas and the newly acquired territories of New Mexico and Utah would be considered as free or slave states or a free or slave territory. The compromise allowed slavery to continue to exist in Washington, D.C., but it outlawed the slave trade, so they couldn't bring people from across Africa across the Middle Passage. The compromise established the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 compelled all citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves and denied enslaved people the right to a jury trial. It also placed control of individual cases in the hands of federal commissions who were paid more for returning a suspected slave than for freeing them, leading many to argue the law was biased in favor of Southern slave owners. This is what starts the documentation, because people are going to be breaking the law. And if you're breaking the law, somebody's got to write about it. Okay? So up until that time, black people were escaping, but there was nothing. There was no law to send them back once they got to Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In fact, there were many towns in not only Pennsylvania, but New York and elsewhere where they drafted what they call the personal liberty laws. So if they made it to that town, they were safe. If somebody came looking for them, say, that's my property. Not here, he's free. But 1850 compromise and the Fugitive Slave Act, we're now dealing with a federal law. So now you can see the states that have slaves, can have slaves, the states that are considered to be free, the territories, and there's a disputed part of what will become more than likely Oklahoma. in there. So that's changing the map. So how do we deal with this federal law? In 1847, freed African Americans, if they were enslaved or not, are sent across the Atlantic back to Africa to settle and create a country called Liberia. The capital of Liberia is Monrovia, named after President James Monroe. Sierra Leone, which is next door to Liberia, was founded by freed British black people. So this is one way to deal with the slavery question. Send them back. William Nesbitt, who was still living in Hollidaysburg at this time, traveled to Liberia in 1853 with another Hollidays family. Their name has been spelled at least that couple of times, if not more, and Samuel Williams from Johnstown. First Presbyterian of Hollidaysburg, was a member of the American Colonization Society and may have provided the funds for these families to travel to Liberia. As I mentioned, it is a West African country and was the first blacks got there in 1822, but it's not recognized until 1847. William Nesbitt stayed there for about 4 months. After he returned, he wrote about his adventures, or what he basically considered to be a scam of moving over there, and that this is not for us, those who live in America but are black. This is not for us. So he is traveling around the country debating this. And he writes that book, 4 Months in Liberia. The preface of it was written by a gentleman, Dr. Martin R. Delaney of Pittsburgh. Dr. Martin Delaney is a physician, an abolitionist, an author. In the Civil War, he will be commissioned as an officer, one of the few blacks to be so. His legacy, he is known as the father of Pan-Africanism. For blacks. We want you to, if you're black, you take care of your own, your schools, your businesses, your churches. You take care of your own because nobody else is going to take care of it. So when you hear about Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, they're pointing back to Dr. Delaney.
Harriet, on that map, there was a Tubman bird. Is that for Harriet Tubman?
I don't think so. I see, okay, I see where you're looking for, but I don't think so. I see a Buchanan, but I'm not, that might be named after President James Buchanan, but I'm not sure. So, who or what was involved to make sure the Underground Railroad worked in this area? First, Masonic lodges, or Masonry. The black men of Altoona founded a Masonic lodge associated with what we call Prince Hall. And the reason we know it, it burned down. So it was recorded. See y'all. It was recorded in the local Huntington newspaper. It probably was also recorded in the Altoona Tribune or the Holidays Register. I just haven't found it yet. And as you can also see, Frederick Douglass' paper, the North Star, noted it as well. The African Methodist Episcopal Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church both claim to be freedom churches. That is because they can claim Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth as members of their denomination. The other reason for these churches to claim as freedom churches is they used what Methodists used, the white Methodists at that time, in rural and large areas, circuit riders. So as you may have noticed from the numbers, there's not a lot of folks living enough to pay a salary of a minister to stay there. So in order for them to get their salary, to collect the assessments that the church demands to pay for the religious leadership, such as bishops, elders, for example, to also provide the religious rites, funerals, weddings, baptisms. They're traveling around. So that could be on horse, that could be a wagon, that maybe depending, might be even a train. We are aware, the Allegheny Portage Railroad was able to document that a woman minister, Jarena Lee, traveled across from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh preaching because she felt called to do that, despite the minister of the AME church saying, women don't preach. So you can see the location where the final building of the Hollidaysburg AME Zion Church is. It's an apartment complex now, but actually it moved there in 1894. It was located actually closer to the Lutheran Church, North Juniata Street area, and it burned down twice. And then the land was purchased by Moses Brown as to where it is now. Out of the Hollidaysburg group, you did have another denomination, and they moved to Altoona. That eventually they were able to get a church, or actually it was a building, donated to them by the First Presbyterian Church of Altoona, the First Methodist Church, the First Lutheran Church, and the First Presbyterian Church all came out of something called the Union Church building. So they start there, then they would build the buildings that they have now and move there. So the black population moves to that Union Church building for the Methodists. And actually you also have coming out of that Union Church what we now call Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church. So they were both two denominations there at that time. Also, I'm picking on the German Baptist Church, or now known as the Brethren Church, and I pick on them because they actually do have documentation about kicking people out of their church who profess slavery is right. They had a conference in Martinsburg around the start of the Civil War. And there is the written documentation about what happened at that conference and what they agreed to do. Oftentimes, there's the Society of Friends, especially in the northern areas, and probably not going to see too much in the southern. But they were there basically as those people who provided money or provided a place to hide or moved them on to the next person. All right. And as I mentioned, the First Presbyterian Church of Hollidaysburg supported black folks through what we call the American Colonization Society. Also, besides I forgot to mention about ministers, they would be carrying not only the local news, but what they've heard from, say, Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or New York, because that was what they were hearing. That's what they were reading. So they could educate the smaller communities as to what is going on outside their community. Yes, there were black-owned newspapers that we know was purchased and read by the black communities in Blair County and probably Bedford and Clearfield and Cambria and Huntington. All right. So I mentioned Dr. Martin Delaney. He wrote a newspaper article called The Mystery. One of the scanned newspapers shows the list of agents. So typically you had to have people who would sell something to folks who was trusted because they're taking money from you. So if I want a newspaper, I want to know that this person isn't going to rob me. So Daniel Williams II and William Nesbitt are listed as agents. So they sold the newspapers in Hollidaysburg. They collect the money and then they send it back to. So Martin Delaney ceases his newspaper and joins Frederick Douglass in his North Star. After the Emancipation Proclamation was in effect in 1863, Frederick Douglass writes an article called Men of Color to Arms. And what he's pushing for is to get black men to enlist in for the Union to fight. His two sons were with the 54th Massachusetts unit. So that's also, it was actually published in a white-owned newspaper, that article. And the African Methodist Episcopal Church had a newsletter. So again, those people doing circuit writing, here's the newspaper. You want it? I need a dime or a nickel or $1 for a year. And they spread news as well across that. Other black-owned newspapers that I've not been able to document but may have been read was the National Era from Washington, D.C., and the Alien American from Cleveland, Ohio, in that time period before the Civil War. So we had folks who went to Liberia, didn't like it. Now they're coming back. They're home. And we've got folks escaping from Maryland and Virginia and coming across the Mason-Dixon line. And in 1855, Jacob Green, he escaped from Romney, West Virginia. Now it's West Virginia, from a plantation in Romney, West Virginia. And he ends up in Hollidaysburg, he's being taken care of by a local barber and minister, Reverend Snyder Carr. He decides to go back to Romney and take more people with him this time. So he does that. He gets 5 people to join him, and they also take horses. That's deadly. I mean, that would get you hung in certain places because that's a lifeline in those rural areas. So he's able to go back. He's one of those pilots, take some folks, and now his owner and the neighbor next to them will go looking for him along with the neighbor's son. They catch a couple of the escaping people in Bedford. They confess, and they tell him where they think Jacob is going. So one person goes to Altoona, one person goes to Johnstown, and one person heads to Hollidaysburg/Gaysport. It is in Hollidaysburg, where this gentleman finds Jacob Green. They are both on a train when Jacob Green recognizes his son, the former master's son. And they both jump off the moving train. The gentleman, Parsons Jr., James Parsons Jr., is able to catch him. Jacob Green actually confessed, according to some of the documents, that, yeah, I'm Jacob. But that jumping off and what the heck is going on draws in people. Everybody likes to see a good riot. So, or maybe create one. So they're coming to see what's happening. One of the local leaders grabs James Parsons and say, "What are you doing here?" He says, "That's my slave." Jake finally gets the idea. I don't know this person. He's kidnapping me. And that creates even more of an uproar. You got black citizens, you got white citizens. They end up beating up James Parsons Jr., 3 or 4 of the black people. And they managed to pull Jacob away, and they sent him further north. Somebody who's done the research on him thinks he ended up coming back to Romney, West Virginia after the Civil War, but we're not sure. So they charged James Parsons Jr. with kidnapping. And there's a big uproar about it because we have the 1850 fugitive slave law. How dare you? We're supposed to enforce the law. You guys, I claim that person as my property. You're supposed to give it to me. So it goes to court. Well, the person who claimed not to be Jacob Green can't be found, so the case is dismissed. The person that represented James Parsons was the state district attorney of Virginia. Hey, whoops, sorry. He was just so excited. So you can see this is an incident that got retold, reprinted, republished across a good part of the nation. The last one of 1856 and the Richmond Dispatch of February 4th, 1856, in one small paragraph, the case was dismissed. That's really what. So what you're now looking at, there is a book, Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania, by Dr. William J. Swatata. He looks at the documentation that Dr. Wilbur Seibert and the late Charles Blockson, who's a Pennsylvania State alum grad, were able to document and put together. So you have to remember, if you're escaping to a state, you're escaping probably to the closest one. So you can see, you can get to Cumberland, Maryland, we might be able to get you further. There are news articles about Cumberland, Maryland, where there is a sexton who would ring the church bell. Sexton is a janitor, cleaner. And that was a signal to, there's somebody here, and we got to get them out of here. So you can see where they might be moved. It wasn't always a direct shot. And these are based upon those letters that people wrote, on obituaries as to where people would go and how they would get there. So something happens in 1862. Yes, the war is here, but we still got the Fugitive Slave Act. So again, back to Cumberland, Maryland, gentleman, he's probably a slave catcher, was told, you need to go get these people and bring back that horse that they took. He finds them in downtown Altoona. I gotta wrap around my head that Altoona wasn't as big as it is somewhat now, that it was even much smaller. He finds the constable, tells the constable, that's my property, I want to take them, and chaos erupts again because people are overhearing this conversation. Apparently they didn't whisper. They're just shouting at each other. All right. They are able to capture a couple of them, arrest them, take them to Hollidaysburg Court, and they are freed. All right. They are freed by the black community and some of the white allies. As the war continued, you would have what we call the contraband. So the Union troop came through, they destroyed the plantation, or they told folks, you're free. The Emancipation Proclamation freed you. Some stayed, but others left. They moved on. I'm free. I can go somewhere else. Or I'm free. I need to find my relatives. I don't know where they were sent. So I thought it was a good way of showing what people might be seeing in 1984 from Altoona Mirror. And this also is from the same article, and you can see some of the towns that they have identified as where the Underground Railroad may have gone through. So, who were these people? If they're bolded, that means they're black. So Reverend John Fiddler, Reverend Alice Rouse, Joseph Crawley, Wyatt Perry, Reverend James Graham, Benjamin Walker, the Ways and Penrose families of the Quaker Corner in Bedford, near Pleasantville, Fishertown area. From Blair County, Daniel Williams II of Hollidaysburg. So let me stop there. If you've ever heard of Dr. Daniel Hale Williams of Hollidaysburg, born in 1858 in Hollidaysburg, he is the first person to do an open heart surgery successfully. That's his daddy. William Nesbitt, who's now living in Altoona, John, also known as Jack Brown, and his family of Hollidaysburg, Reverend Snyder Carr, lived in Gaysport, Thomas Shorter, who moved from Huntington to Hollidaysburg to eventually to Altoona, then Samuel S. Blair of Hollidaysburg. He's an elected official. He's a lawyer. When he dies, the black community puts a resolution in the local newspaper thanking him for his efforts in helping the Underground Railroad be successful here. Dr. Robert W. Oliver of Altoona, Reverend A.B. Clark of Altoona, Dr. Crawford Irwin of Hollidaysburg, Reverend R.A. Murphy, David C. Hensey. From Cambria County, we have A.A. Barker, William Sleet, Benjamin Sleet, Darrell Morrow, John Cushion, James and Charlotte Heslop, and Samuel Williams. Clearfield, George Hartson, and George Atkinson. Central County, Reverend William H. Mills Sr., Judge Houston, Reverend James Lynn, Reverend H.R.C. Holloway, and Judge Walker. I'm kind of impressed there were some ministers who were, I want to do the good thing. I want to do something good here. Let me go to the Central County. Reverend William H. Mills Sr. Anybody heard of the Mills brothers? Mills family? That's granddaddy. Right? Those of you who have not heard of the Mills brothers, go to YouTube. All right. So, St. Luke Episcopal Church. Yes. There's one building there that is original. It is considered to be the oldest building in Altoona. Would have been the parsonage. When Reverend Dr. W. Oliver dies, the obituary, he dies in Nebraska, but there's a good-sized obituary in Altoona Tribune that says he was an abolitionist. There's also an oral story that when John Brown was looking for recruits to help him at Harper's Ferry, he stayed in that parsonage. It's an oral story. But I want you to, yeah, maybe John Brown was here. We know he was in Bedford, so maybe he came here. All right. So, other oral stories. David Brown of Hollidaysburg, son of Jack Brown, names Nicholas Hewitt, Jacob Snyder, John Brotherland, Stephen Potts, Colonel William Stone, Chris Yeager, L.A. Holiday, and Thomas Rooney, all of Hollidaysburg, as Underground Railroad agents. In an article the Mount Zion was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. He then also shared a story for the next day in the Altoona Tribune of four fugitive slaves that were escaped in a plantation in Virginia, found hiding in the Chimney Rocks around the year of 1858. David might have been 15 years old. When they heard that these folks were up there, they came and brought them down. They were placed in the old Blair County Jail in protective custody. The district attorney left and placed it in the hands of the assistant district attorney to deal with. The owner of the escaped slaves was informed that the fugitives were living in Hollidaysburg. Before he could get to them, the black residents of the town took matters into their own hands, removed the fugitives out of the county jail, and with the assistance of several white citizens, moved that group of people to Canada. And interesting, at least one of the slaves comes back, or formerly enslaved person comes back. David meets the daughter, falls in love, marries her. Obituaries. There are obituaries. So we have Samuel, also called Black Sam Williams. He was living in Duncansville, got on the Portage Railroad, saw his master, had a knife in his hand, just in case. Former master never saw him. Madison, Washington, said he was enslaved in the South, able to escape, came to Hollidaysburg in about 1842. Porter at the Daniels House, hotel, restaurant, private dining, did not sell alcoholic drinks. I'm amazed. And he was a member of the Hollidaysburg Keystone Band, and it was held at Remy's Hall in Hollidaysburg, which was headquarters of the band. That's true. Altoona. Alexis Reeder was born a slave in Montgomery County, Virginia. Says he was owned by several families, and he was enslaved in Culver, Maryland, was able to escape, and he came to Baker's Furnace. His son was James Reeder, who also worked for Baker's, and Alexis is buried in St. John's Church Cemetery in Altoona, according to the obituary. Thomas Thornburg lived in Hollidaysburg, moved to Huntington. Unfortunately, there were no of those welfare checks at the time. So, but he was found in poor health, and so they've noted that. Elizabeth Ross Irons obituary. So she's brought to Bedford by her owner. She overhears that he is going to sell her. She's able to get with the minister, Reverend John Fiddler, and he brings her to Hollidaysburg. Reverend Fiddler was an AME Zion minister, and I've seen his name with Hollidaysburg several times. So he's moving back and forth from Bedford to Hollidaysburg. William Jackson was also found in Chimney Rock, he and his father, by David Brown and the dog, their family dog. They had escaped from Cumberland, Maryland, made it to Bedford, and then to Chimney Rock. They brought them down to his house. David brought them down to their family. They found jobs with Judge Minster's Mill. I love this last statement. Married 4 times, outliving each of his wives. All right, and he is buried in the Union Cemetery of Hollidaysburg. All right, so guess what? That's my documentation. So you can see in my acknowledgments, thank you, Blair County Historical Society. Blair County Genealogical Society, I give you all, I fault you every time I do this, because they're the ones who got me hooked. All right, Penn State Altoona. And the project came about because Cummings McNett, who was the curator of here in the Railroaders Museum, ran a movie, Miles and Smiles, about the Porters. After the movie was ran, Reverend Paul Johnson basically talked to Cummings McNett for hours about documenting the history of Black folks who came to this area through what we call the Great Migration. So if you're not familiar with that, when World War I starts, the young men go off to war. The young men who go off to war are white. They need bodies. So Pennsylvania Railroad and other businesses would send Black clerks down to the South to tell those sharecroppers, you can make a lot more money up north. You'll be treated better up north. So that continues on basically from from the start of World War I to 1970, that migration. So that's how you get Chicago blues, Mississippi to Chicago. All right. And last, the logo is an artwork of a former Blair County resident, Keith Mallett. He was a classmate of Reverend Paul Johnson, or he is a classmate, he's still living. But he created the African Americans picture and permitted us to use this artwork for the project and the festival. And if anybody's got a cell phone and a QR code, you can find my website, or you can just Google it. Thank you again. How long have I kept you people? Question?
Harriet, I don't know about Brown's Pond. Can you enlighten us on Brown's Pond?
I'm so sorry. All right. So Moses Brown, being a restaurant owner and a caterer, needs to keep his food cold. So this is before what we consider to be modern day refrigeration. So what used to be the pond across from Dysart Park, which is now the YMCA of Hollidaysburg, that was Brown's Pond. And when it froze, you could skate on it. The other thing I need to tell you about Moses Brown, he owned the land that we now call Blairmont Country Club and Seville Hills. And it was sold. He was the richest Black man in this county when he lived.
When did he live?
So he came here 1827. He was born 1827, died 1916. Yes, sir.
The large house on Juniata Street, supposedly had the tunnel out. You hear that story all the time.
That too.
Is that not true?
Not true. Hey, Jim, you want to explain that?
The brownstone by the State Police Barracks
Yes.
on part of historic Hollidaysburg, and that's Colonel Jack's house. He didn't buy the property until 1864. And the stone house does not show up in the tax records until 1869. And that was probably his wine cellar. That's one of the three myths.
There are lots of myths there. Yes.
Those that escaped and made it to Canada, is there data on their fate? Was there a large number that stayed in Canada?
Unfortunately, I've not found anything that says, how many stayed and how many came back. There were people who did stay. There were settlements up there. There are people who can claim to be, my folks came from the United States escaping slavery. They just stayed. But unfortunately, no. That's not asked in the census records, which would have been the best place to ask that. So you don't have that. Yes.
Any of the magazines, like the North Star, that publish some of this information, has anyone found copies of those here in Blair County?
Not that I'm aware of. The North Star, the Christian Recorder, the Mystery. Right now, most of that's like digitized. And when they can get their hands on that paper to do that. Yes.
I think we heard at one point that there were underground tunnels under Blairmont too, isn't that right? So I guess that's not true. No. The Moses Smith got bigger there too.
Yeah. When the one thing I couldn't find the article again. When the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act is passed, there's an interesting article where Daniel Williams buys land on that area. So I'm not sure if he was buying it to help those who were coming in or whatnot. So then I saw.
I had a question about the, back then everything was documented well. So if you're a slave and they're freeing you, why didn't they get something that said that? I am the owner, I'm releasing these people, and they take it with them. I don't get that. So then they would say, hey, here's my paperwork, we're good. Why? I'm not sure of that. Because everything that was documented back then about owners, we still have books from the 1800s about deeds that are still read today. I don't get why. You know what I mean?
Yes, his brother and another member of the family claimed he was insane and that they wanted to invalidate the will.
But I'm not just talking about that person, though. All the slaves that were freed at one point or another, why didn't they get something to say that? To say, hey, they're releasing me from whatever I'm in, and here's my paperwork.
Probably not even thinking about that. The people who are being free, probably not even thinking about something like that.
Then the stories I'm hearing out of Bedford about the railroad, the Underground Railroad, why isn't anything about that? Why, I don't, watching your presentation, there's nothing about how they got them out, what they did. It's just hitting on certain points about who lived here. What about the actual Underground Railroad?
So you probably have a couple of things going on.
Okay.
Memories.
Okay.
People who knew it are dead or left. But you may also have other things. As I mentioned, Reverend Elias, Rose, they're mentioned in those letters that Dr. Wilbur Seibert's gathers. In most cases, they say, I'm so sorry, this gentleman died about a couple of years ago, but here's the story I remember. So it's timing, and that what someone was thinking about. These people are dying. We need to get this information now. Just, hey, they were free. I mean, it's an attitude of, well, they're free, as opposed to, my goodness, they're free. Let's do Juneteenth. Wait, I think I saw one hand there. Yes.
Yeah, I have seen information where a lot of times freed people were gathered up, and no matter what kind of documentation, it didn't matter. They were drugged to the South and enslaved.
So, yeah, what your
documentation
didn't count. The Dred Scott case that occurs in the late 1850s, and the Supreme Court deliberated it in Bedford Springs. James Buchanan said that's a good place to go to get out of the hotness of Washington, D.C. It stated that black people had no rights. This was a gentleman who had moved to a free state. Then his slave owner wanted him back, and he sued. The Dred Scott sued. And then the court case that was decided by the Supreme Court, and eventually removed by, which amendment? Probably the 14th. Removed by the 14th Amendment, said, you're not a citizen. So that's also could go to, well, prove I'm free. If I can't vote, oh yeah, Pennsylvania disenfranchised black men in 1838 or 1832. So they couldn't vote, they couldn't be on juries, depending, they may not be able to own land. They are being told to sit in the back of the transportation. So all these indignities are going on, and you need to have, it would be nice to have a law that says it and recognizes it. You need a question.
My question was really more of a comment to the gentleman in the back. I think one of the reasons when people were escaping, that was illegal. When you were helping them escape, that was illegal. So there is no documentation because it was like the resistance in the wars. This was a resistance effort and very secretive. All these things that Harriet has been able to put together and these others have constructed is from trying to put secretive stuff together because you could not document. People would have been arrested and the routes would have been, slave owners were smart enough to send detectives after people. So a lot of the reason it's hard to follow it all is because, and that's why it's stories and anecdotes, it was secretive. And it was illegal.
Okay, you and then, yes.
Harriet, do you have any documentation or evidence of any sites in Blair County that quite possibly could have been stations for the Underground Railroad? I mean, we've heard of places like the tunnels under Blair, but did you find anything in your research?
The closest would be where William Nesbitt lived. Where's that book? the book about the 4 months in Liberia. On the back of it is a mural. Which way? That way? Yeah. The mural that you can see on Altoona Pipe and Steel. And they talk about his address. I don't know if that address still exists. That street still exists. They've done so many things, like there used to be Bridge Street.
It says 10th Avenue.
10th Avenue?
Yes, it says he lived on 10th Avenue.
On 10th Avenue.
It doesn't put his address. It just says Altoona.
The other place I thought about was Logan House and all those houses and barbershops. I found out.
It's really hard to see.
All right, 10. They were able to, yeah. Was all those barbershops and black porters that are at Logan House and other hotels. So if somebody's coming in new, oh, I know this brother. He's my cousin. So you got black employees in where you can get off from transportation if you've been riding a train or riding a horse or wagon or whatnot. So that might be another place. But again, I don't know.
It's on that level 1 to 5. You don't have no 5s.
But it's close. William Nesbitt, I'll pick on him. When William Nesbitt dies in 1895, it is mentioned that he's an Underground Railroad conductor. The following year, 1896, Benjamin H. Walker from Pleasantville dies, and in that same death notice, it mentions William Nesbitt. That's my closest one.
Harriet?
Yes.
I might mention, again, in response to the gentleman in the back, there's a brochure out there about a slave, a former slave called Festus Hollinger. And in his story, he tells how the family moved from northern Virginia through Bedford and Woodbury and on into Altoona. And evidently they didn't just pass through, they stopped and stayed there and lived there for a while, and then moved to the next stop. And also the brochure, so that gives you a pathway of that, how at least one person came north in the bank. And when they arrived in Altoona, they were hidden in the home of Benjamin Custer,
the cousin of General George Custer, and he lived across the street from St. Luke's Church, where the Reverend Oliver that Harriet mentioned, and that was a conduit for the Underground Railroad. So he lived there with his mother. So that's a nice pamphlet to look at. The pamphlet with the Logan House that they held up has that map of the routes in Pennsylvania that the slaves escaped the Underground Railroad route. And then we have a third brochure about another gentleman. They called him Colonel Thomas.
Major John Thomas.
Major John Thomas. Major was a complimented term, but he also escaped north, and there's his story and how he worked on the canal and would drive the boat from Hollidaysburg to Georgetown, back and forth, and each trip he would tell the passengers all about life in the South. And he became very well known. It was like people would ride the boat just to listen to his stories. And he was invited by the Mountain City Baseball Club, the White Baseball Club, to come and present his story to the baseball club members, which was rather unusual. And he would hang out at the Logan House, and the people would love to go to the Logan House and sit outside on the benches and listen to him tell his story. So he must have been a very colorful person. So we do have those stories, and we've written them up in a couple of brochures here.
I want to thank the Blair County Historical Society for doing that. It's another thing to help. It's another way to go out to keep it going. So forth. Yes, go on.
I just have to add on this historic day. Today is the 175th anniversary of the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, which took place on July 19 and July 20 in Seneca Falls, and it grew out from the abolitionist movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some of the others that were involved had been at the World Abolitionist Conference, and it was all about freeing the slaves and so forth. And they said, what about we women? They were told they couldn't have a vote and had to sit up in the balcony. And a few years later, they got together and had the Women's Rights Convention. So happy anniversary, women.
Jim.
Elizabeth Stanton's face is part of the
One of those faces.
One of the top things.
Oh, okay.
When you go into the new entrance, they're on the second floor. There was a black man with a chain around his neck, and both links are broken. So this is 1875.
Yeah, so if you, the county courthouse has stone carvings of people. With Street Lane? I'm trying to remember where certain, Allegheny, but I think also on the side street and all around. It's all around. So, yeah, if you want to have a game, they have a match game, the Blair County Genealogical Society. So, so if you want to spend some time walking around the courthouse and try to identify who some of those stone carvings are, might be interesting. Okay, people gotta go home. Yeah, so.
Another place, we had a cabin down in Fulton County, and they had house tours several years ago. And one of the houses was down in Norfolk, very old farmhouse. And when we took the tour, they showed us this trapdoor in the basement, underground. Supposedly was where slaves hid,
And then they go up and then when it's time to move along.
They said that the name was McKibben. So I had to ask Dr. McKibben if he had any relatives in Murfreesboro. He said, oh, my great-grandfather. And I said, well, I wonder if that was their house. I was curious. I wasn't 100% sure I was talking about the same house, but it sounded
Could be interesting. I wish I could go out further up, but sometimes I have to stop in certain things.
I just have an economic question. Like, I don't understand economically how it was in their interest to even try to go after the fugitive slaves.
So the question is about,
pretty far.
Yeah, the question is about economics. The thing is, once you have one runaway, you can have others run away. And it's like Jacob Green, he was going to go get more and take with him. So I'm on the other side. I'm glad. But, right. But the economics behind it in this case would have been, that's my property walking away, not a human. My property. So a different mindset there.
Yeah, we have a house in our family that's very old. It was built in the 1700s. And went all the way through. My father still has a painting studio there. But, we found a room in it after my father the house was handed over to him some years ago. And it took us a year or so to realize there had to be a room behind these walls because there was too much space. And so eventually we went into the attic and there was a trap door that went down into a room. But if you couldn't get into it any other way, it had wallpaper, a chair, a table. I can't remember what else was there. So I was talking to my uncle who was a historian and had written quite a few books about it. And he said, oh yeah, he said that was an underground railroad room. There were several in the little towns there. Back at the time, the locals wouldn't have told anybody that was only for people who lived there. But of course, people on the railroad and the conductors were people. And he said, that's what it was. Probably nobody knew it was there after they shut it up. But looking on the map, I see that actually that route between Cherry Tree and Grantham Hills, that's where that town is. So
you're traveling. I mean, the routes for traveling. You don't, again, people moving.
Yeah, why would they go through there? But that is along that route. I was confused as a child because I thought, as a little child, why would we have an underground railroad station when they were trying? I thought they were in the south, And of course, my uncle would say, no, they were still being pursued here. So anyway, so they always thought that's kind of neat. We've got it in a while, but it's still there.
All right, neat. I'm sorry. Was there a question?
Where was the town?
Well, the town was
called Marin, Pennsylvania. If you look on the internet, you can find it. Marron. It's mostly Amish people now. Lots of Amish. We have that house where a lot of the Amish have bought the farms. A lot of horse and buggies out there. That's a beautiful town with a lot of very, very old homes in it. So.
I guess I need to dismiss y'all. Y'all been here too long. Thank you.